And now, two guys that survived a weekend at Bernie's, Aaron and Jonathan.
Howdy, and welcome to episode 59 of In the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. In this episode, Jonathan plays hooky, and the Davises take me to school. I'm your host, Aaron, and you are in the rabbit hole, safe and sound. Before we begin today, Jonathan and I wanted to forego the commercial to send our condolences, thoughts, and prayers to everyone in the Midwest that has been recently affected by the tornadoes. We wish you all a speedy recovery. We are here today with Ron Davis, once again, from EMS Newbie Podcast, and his better half is finally in the studio, too, Anna. This is a show that we've been talking about doing for quite a while, which is homeschooling, and something I know absolutely nothing about, but y'all have quite a bit of experience with, both personally and professionally. So, say hi.
Hello.
This is Dr. Suanna Davis, my lovely bride.
She is a lovely, lovely woman. Well, I guess let's jump right in, and what you've got, like, this massive notes here. I'm a little intimidated. So I guess let's jump right in. What would be our reasons for wanting to homeschool? It's something personally I've been interested in because I just do not like the way that I see children being educated these days. For example, math to me is kind of a big thing that no one gets taught math anymore. They get taught how to operate a calculator, which to me is just, I'll say it, asinine. But with that said, so what are the reasons that you guys went into homeschooling for?
That's a different question because Ron was really pro homeschooling, but I knew I would be doing the work.
Yes.
So it's really easy to be pro homeschooling when you're not the person doing it.
Yeah.
And I was fairly sure that once I started, I'd be doing it forever. And I wasn't interested in that either. Like, oh yeah, a year, no problem. Mm-hmm. 18, not so much. Mm-hmm. But I did kindergarten and pre-K, and that was fun. And then I was like, okay, I don't want to do this forever. So Elijah, my oldest, had been taught to read, but he wouldn't read. He said, oh, Mom, you're the only one who wants me to read because I'm a big reader. The kid went into first grade because I put him in a private school where we paid big bucks for the best education we could get. And he went in being able to do triple digits math questions with carrying in his head, addition and subtraction, but not reading. Mm. A week into school, he was reading on the same level as all the kids who'd been reading for a year. And she said, see, I taught him how to read. And she made them use the number line for 0 through 9.
What is the number line?
So you had to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plus 3. 1, 2, 3, 8. He was doing triple digit. I could say 342 minus 112, and he could give me the answer. Or 114 with the borrowing and carrying. He could give me the answer. Mm-hmm. And then she's making him count for 0 through 9.
Yeah. So back to, I think, what we were talking about a little bit from the show of one of the issues being the whole class gets brought down to the slowest student.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of problems. My reasons for wanting to homeschool were more philosophical, and her reasons for not wanting to were more practical. Philosophically, when people say, why did you homeschool? I always say, because the teacher-student ratio is really good.
Yeah.
And, people look at schools, and that's the thing they say, oh, what's the teacher-student ratio? It's only 30-1 or 25-1. I'm like, well, ours was 2-1. Mm-hmm. And she had a PhD, which you don't have to have a PhD. We'll talk about that later. But to me, that was it. And the other thing is you control the curriculum. You control the rate that they work. And in school, since you have 30 kids, there's a lot of wasted time for two reasons. One is the rate is determined by the slowest kid in the class, or it's not determined by the slowest kid, and the slowest kid gets left behind. Mm. And that slowest kid may not be the slowest kid every time. It may be that, he's faster in math and slower in reading, but the class goes at the same rate. So the kid who's faster in math is sitting there waiting, he's done his paper and he has to spend the next 20 minutes waiting for the rest of the class to finish. And the slowest kid, isn't getting the math at all. But then the next week they have writing, and now the math kid is like taking the whole thing, and the writing kid isn't. So there's no variation. Whereas if they were homeschooled, if the kid's fast in math and he gets done in 5 minutes, you're on to the next subject. If it takes him half the day to do it, then you can take half a day and do it and make sure he gets it so that you don't leave him behind. So you control the rate of it. You control what gets taught. You just have a huge amount of control because it's just you and your kid. There's a small number. Well, depending on the size of your family, we have friends who have like 13 kids, and that's
then it's a little higher, but that's still a good private school ratio. 13.
Yeah, that's still that's an expensive private school ratio.
Yeah, and so it ends up being, there's those kind of advantages, and we know people who have kids with learning disabilities, and they do better because you can kind of tailor how you teach those kids.
And there are IRBs in public school, but you have a class of 30
What's an
kids.
IRB?
Oh, the individual instruction sheets where learning disabled kids have a separate way of learning. Mm-hmm. But when there's 30 kids in a class, sure, I can do that separate way of learning for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
That's it. I can give them 5 minutes of extra help. When it was my child who didn't learn to read when they were 5 and didn't learn to read when they were 6, and didn't learn to read when they were 7, and didn't learn to read when they were 8, I could read the work to them. Mm-hmm. We could talk through the answers. I could say, what did I just tell you? What did you hear about this history? How did we do this science experiment? And he could answer me verbally with the information he'd learned, which means he had a really good memory development. He learned to do questions and answers. He learned to respond adequately and give details. Mm-hmm. And then when his brain was ready to learn to read at 8.5, he learned to read in a year. Mm-hmm. In a year, from 8.5 to 9.5, he went from no reading at all to 12th grade level reading. Mm-hmm. So if he'd been in a public school, he'd have been identified as a slow learner. He'd have been identified as learning disabled. Yeah. He'd have been identified as special needs. And he was the kind of kid who, if you told him that, he'd take that label on and he would live it out. Mm-hmm. So I'm really glad I wasn't homeschooling. Yeah. I mean, I was homeschooling and not public schooling or private schooling even.
And I think, especially these days, we've got so many kids, whether they are accurately or inaccurately diagnosed as ADD or not, being as somebody and being in a room with somebody else who's ADD. But if you're intelligent enough and have ADD, you then learn to fake your way through a lot of things, at least fake your way of paying attention to at least appease whoever the authority figure is. So it's like, well, I want to daydream, but I know how to look like I'm not daydreaming or screwing off.
Right. And that's because you're not doing something you're having to sit there and wait for everybody else. I mean, you hear about those kids all the time that are like really smart and they don't apply themselves, or they don't, they're not really into it. And it's like, well, it's because you're teaching us the same thing you taught us last year and it's boring as heck. Mm-hmm. And we can't go and do something we think is interesting.
Yeah.
And that's kind of another thing. You control the curriculum. Mm-hmm. There is, and we can talk about a little, it depends on where you're at in the world and where you're at in the States, what you have to teach. And then there's how to teach particular subjects. But in the end, you control what you teach. And like as a prepper, and I know you guys are big on skills, you can make that part of the curriculum. If you think your kid needs to learn how to pick locks, you can teach your kid how to pick locks,
that is the one skill, and I have thought about that, and I've thought, at what point in their development would I be willing to teach them that?
Yeah, when you don't want to be able to lock them up.
Yes.
Or lock something else up.
You don't have anything you want locked away.
Yeah, exactly. Well, at that point, everything needs to be a combination lock.
Yeah. Right. So there's all, whatever it is that you want to teach them, that skill, you can just make it part of the curriculum. Mm-hmm. Another thing is that, like, kids, they get into things at different points in their life. They may suddenly get into dinosaurs and they just think dinosaurs are the greatest. And in a school, you may study dinosaurs and they may be enough to like get them interested in it. But now you've got to go on to, chemistry or whatever, whatever's next on the curriculum. And one of the things you can do at homeschooling is say, okay, we're just going to stop and do dinosaurs. You're into dinosaurs. We'll study dinosaurs and we can apply chemistry to that, or biology or whatever. And we can just let you dig into it as far as you want to dig into it and put everything off for a while. You kind of control that and you can let the kid really dive into what they want. When they get bored with that, you can go back to the regular curriculum and pick up where you left off and go along. And since you're not taking, all that wasted time that's in a classroom education, you can now apply that. You can use that to let them explore the stuff they want to explore too.
Yeah, a couple of points on that. Elijah went to a private school for first grade. And when his brother was talking about going to high school in 11th grade, public high school, his brother, Elijah, said, you don't want to. All you do is sit around and wait.
Yeah.
You do your work and then you sit there and you have to be quiet and you can't move and you can't wiggle and you can't, and 3/4 of your day is sitting there waiting for other people.
Yeah.
That's what he remembers from first grade. The one that's supposed to be fun and exciting. Kids are really, I'm in school. I'm in real school. Yeah. You sit and you wait. And he still thinks of that. That's how he thinks of public school.
Yeah, and from a bright kid's perspective, that's, a lot of what school's like. We talk about, too, I know this didn't happen every time, but you would set the goal for the day, today we're going to learn X. And, we tell our kids, if you get it done in an hour, you're done. And you can go play video games, whatever it is you want to do. And some days they would be like, okay, yay, and they would get it done. And others are like, I don't want to do this. And so they would sit there all day. And, it's like, you're just wasting your own time. But if that's the way you want to play it, we'll do it that way today.
Yeah, that's an interesting part of it. But you were going to add in.
That happened when, how schools, I don't know if this happened to you, but you have summer break. And then you go back to whatever grade, second. Well, you spend 6 weeks reviewing first grade.
Yeah.
I was always bored as heck. Why are we sitting here doing what we did last year? Let's do something new.
Yeah.
And then same thing happens after second grade. You do second grade for 6 weeks. I always thought that was totally stupid until I started homeschooling my kids and we took summer break. And then my kids didn't remember what we'd studied 3 months ago.
Yeah.
And I went, oh, I'm weird. I'm an aberration. They're more normal.
Yeah.
So we started going to year-round school. I didn't have to teach them 365 days a year. We could take a month off for Christmas. We could take a week off when I got sick or they got tired of doing stuff. We could take a week and go to the Northeast and do the Revolutionary War history and go to Valley Forge and not do any math necessarily. And
y'all were on your own schedule.
It wasn't any big deal. So you could do whatever you wanted to. And we actually did way more than was required. So we'd do 2 years of science every year. So from first grade for my younger son to sixth grade, or second grade to seventh for my older son, we did 2 years of science every year.
Oh, wow.
Because I'd pick one curriculum up, we'd get it done, we'd do the next one. Because they loved science. They thought that was fun. I loved science. It was fun. So we did 2 different curriculums. So we'd do first and second grade in this one, and then second and third in the next one. And then third and fourth in one, and then fourth and fifth in the next one. So they got tons more science than they'd have gotten anywhere else. And it worked. And that's with my child who didn't learn to read till he was 8.5. He was still doing 2 years of science because I was reading and we were doing the experiments, and you can do that.
To take a sidetrack that'll get us into the how, can you talk about the curriculums? You just said, I got a curriculum in science for a grade. Because a lot of people are going to be like, well, I wouldn't know what to teach. And just tell a little how that works.
Okay. Well, when you're new, you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? Yes, I know. I had an education degree and I still didn't know what I was doing.
Really?
They don't teach you that.
Yeah.
They go, you're going to go to school. They'll give you your books. You teach out of those. There's a teacher plan.
So as a teacher, you go and then it's pretty much here. Just give this to the kids.
Yes. And it depends on your school district. They pick the books. So you don't pick the books. But as a homeschooling mom, you pick the books, you pick the curriculum, you decide. So I went to a homeschool store and looked through books going, oh my goodness, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I went to a public teacher's school store, and I love their stuff. It's more expensive because it's created to be used for 30 kids.
Yeah.
But the artwork is better, and you get a lot more variation in levels of ability. So you can go get 3 or 4 different ones and take your kid through an entire year with 4 different levels. Make sure they go from the lowest level to the highest level by the end. And that's one of the things I really like about homeschooling. My kids had to learn to mastery. They had to make 100 before they could go on. So if they made 100 the first time, they were done.
Yeah.
And if they didn't, they had to keep going till they made 100. And then they had the day off. So pretty quickly they learned, gee, I'll just get 100 the first time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's a big deal. So you go in and you don't know. I was overwhelmed. It wasn't my idea. I was terrified. I was overwhelmed. He was smart. It was a great idea. But at the time, I was just scared. And we had a friend who was homeschooling, and she said, oh, Sue Ann, it's not that hard. 15 minutes a day, formal education for a kindergartner.
15 minutes a day?
Yes.
Kindergartner.
For a kindergartner.
For a kindergartner.
Then you add 15 minutes for first grade, so it's 30 minutes a day. Then second grade, 45 minutes a day. Third, a whole hour.
Oh my God, not an hour.
And the idea was you can do in 15 minutes what it takes a class of 30 kids 4 hours to do. And then you can have recess and nap time and lunch and breakfast and, snack and play. So I went, I can do 15 minutes. I can do 30 minutes. I can do 45 minutes. And what I did at the beginning was I said to my oldest, what do you want to study? And he said, weather. I'm really interested in weather. And I said, okay. So I went to the store and I looked through all the curriculums looking for stuff I could do for weather. And I bought Konos because they had a bunch of stuff on weather. It's a big fat book about 500 words. 500 pages. And I brought it home and I went weather. I marked them all and we did all weather stuff. We did weather stuff for 2.5 months. Math weather, reading weather.
But in that point, the child's actually engaged, emotionally engaged in what you're doing and really wanting to learn the subject matter as opposed to being forced to.
He's like, I'm learning weather. And you're like, well, in order to understand that, you're going to have to be able to add these numbers together.
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, then I'll learn this piece of math,
Yeah, well, and then the math is relevant.
Right.
As opposed to, like, most of us sat in school going, what am I going to ever use this for?
Yeah. So it's like you're motivated. I mean, I think you guys talked about motivation once, but there's like 2 kinds of motivation. There's intrinsic and extrinsic. And you suddenly make it, there's a reason I need to learn this. So even though I didn't really want to learn this abstractly, I'm going to go ahead and learn it. And so you get that while letting them study what they want to study. And it's not like you're saying, okay, well, we're going to study weather and blow off math for a year.
Right.
It's like, we're going to study weather, but guess what? As part of weather, you're going to have to learn some math or you're not going to understand weather.
And we're going to do social science. You're going to learn the history of how we harnessed electricity and all that stuff. And we did that for about 2.5 months. And then it was his birthday and we had a weather party. We got art that you drew on and it changed in the sun. We got water guns for rain. We got sun piñata and beat it and yellow candy fell out. And that was our culminating event for our weather unit. And then it was my other son's birthday coming up, and he picked dinosaurs. So we did math for dinosaurs. We did science for dinosaurs. We did reading on dinosaurs. We did art for dinosaurs. And in about 2.5 months, when it was his birthday, we had a huge dinosaur party. And we put little sprinkles that were shaped like phones on graham crackers with chocolate icing for dirt. And we did, paleontology s'mores or something. And we had birdseed in pans with puzzle pieces for dinosaur puzzles. And they would have to find all the puzzle pieces through the birdseed and then put the dinosaur puzzle together, which is a math thing. We did music. We learned a dinosaur song. We played games with dinosaurs.
So it's, again, the child's actually engaged, and they're being taught everything, but they're taught in a manner that makes sense to that child. Well, this is why I need to know this if I'm going to understand this thing that interests me.
Yeah.
And for me, that got me over being scared.
Yeah.
Because I had a topic I was looking for, and then I was filing all the things we needed to learn within that topic. That got me through the first 5 months, and then I just did regular stuff.
So what kind of resources, you talked about going to the store for homeschooling, the store for public school. What kind of resources? Because I would imagine now that there's probably a pretty big online community and maybe even support system. I'm saying this and I don't actually know. I'm just making an assumption here, but I would imagine that now digitally there are a lot of resources and connected.
And for all teachers. I mean, for my college classes, I go online and see what somebody did on Beowulf, so I don't have to recreate the paperwork. You know, oh, you have questions. Oh, I don't like that one, but I like this one and this one and this one. And so even for my college class, I don't redo all my stuff.
Yeah.
And for my kids, I'd go online and I'd go, oh, that sounds cool. I think they'd like that. Oh, they didn't. Okay, well, what else can I find?
Yeah.
You know? But also all the major cities have conventions once a year, at least in the South, where they bring in a bunch of different publishers for private and public schools. And there's used book sales from parents and homeschooling co-ops.
Oh, neat.
And so you can go in and you can talk to people who have taught with those books. You can talk to the publishers. You can look through. They give you, you know, pieces as gifts so that they'll want you to buy theirs to finish that curriculum. And that's a really cool thing, especially when you're trying to figure out what curriculum you want to use. The first couple of years, except for the, you know, what do you want to learn? That was easy. I could do that. But I'd buy way too much curriculum.
Really?
Because I didn't know.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, well, I want to do this. So that looks good and that looks good. And I ended up spending more money than I really should have because I'd end up with like 5 curriculums. Well, for us, that was okay. Because my kids would go through stuff really fast. So we'd do a Bacchus curriculum, and we'd do the ASCII curriculum, and then we'd do the Bob Jones, and then we'd do the public school, and then we'd do something else. And so we had lots of curriculum. And we didn't use all of it, but we'd use quite a bit of it. And when I found one that did not work for my kids, my oldest son would not look at a book if it did not look good, if the design was not well done. So after one book of those where he just pitched a fit every time he looked at it, I was like, okay, good design, requirement, good art. Can't, you know, it can be black and white, but it has to be good art.
Yeah.
And I learned. And he was more interested if the art was good.
Yeah.
And he wasn't going to look at it, except under duress if it wasn't. My younger son was like, okay, whatever, I'll read this. You want me to read this? Okay, I'll read that.
Yeah.
You know, but because of his brother, he got well-designed books.
Yeah.
So he has a better feeling for design than he would have on his own.
But, and then there again, as doing with homeschooling, you're able to actually take the time to tailor what you've got and what you're presenting to the child.
Yes.
So that they are as engaged as they possibly could be versus being in a classroom with 30 other people or more these days. I think they're stuffing even more in classes these days.
Some depend.
And where the child is just kind of, you know, play along with the group or fall behind one or the other.
And one of the things that she kind of mentioned there is, and you mentioned it being online, but there are communities of homeschoolers. They very much interact with one another. There are co-ops. I know that one of the things that people worry about is what happens when I hit the point where I don't know what I need to teach. You know, I mentioned before that really what your kids need, probably all the way through elementary school, most people, especially anybody college educated, understands all that stuff. I mean, you understand reading, writing, and arithmetic. You could teach that. But when you get to, you know, now it's time to teach them calculus, you may or may not understand that. You know, maybe they get to calculus and then you don't understand that. And you have to figure out what to do. Well, a lot of communities have homeschooling co-ops. Well, you have the dad who can teach calculus for this family, so that's not their worry, but he can't teach how to write. You know, no one in that family is like can teach literature, whatever. So they come together and they actually have classes, and you send your kid and he takes calculus from that guy. And, you teach, English literature, whatever. So they have these co-ops that bring that stuff together. And generally they go all the way down and they have kind of like, I want to call them fun classes, but they're specialized extracurricular classes. And so your kids can go do that maybe one day a week. They'll go to that and they'll take a class on dinosaurs, or I forgot all the stuff you taught. You taught something crazily creative every year. I forgot what, some of them were. They were part of the extracurriculars. And then as your kid advances and they get to that high school point where maybe not everybody can teach everything, then they can take more in-depth courses from that. When our eldest turned 14 and he needed to take advanced math, we put him in the community college.
Yeah, now wait, let me back up just a little bit. Because yes, but our co-op was the co-op situation we were in was a little bit different. At middle school age, they offered science, math, English, history. Mm-hmm. And you could pick which of those four, and you paid for it. Mm-hmm. So there were homeschooling parents or retired people teaching those classes in areas of specialization that they had. And if you could do history and science, but not math and writing, then you would sign up for the math and the writing. And those were 2-day-a-week classes for an hour and a half each. Other co-ops, like my girlfriend out in North Carolina, they get together and it's free, but you have to teach 2 hours a week.
Yeah.
And I have to teach 2 hours a week. And the other person has to, each family has a requirement to teach 2 hours a week in their specialization. Well, the particular one we were in the Kingwood area had the middle school through high school classes. And they had a Friday, Super Friday, extracurricular day. And that was when the homeschool moms could go to the grocery store without their children. Okay? They could go to the post office. They could sit down and read a book by themselves. And the classes were things like, we had yo-yo. Mm-hmm. I taught dinosaurs and dragons. We looked at paleontology stuff, and we looked at historical and mythological dragons and how those might be connected. And we wrote stories. The kids drew art. We did math and everything with dinosaurs and dragons. We did one games and races through history, where we started with the Assyrians and we played games they played. And we moved all the way up through the Greeks and then the Romans and then the Vikings. And we didn't quite make it where I wanted to. We didn't make it to the automobile race around the world. But in one semester of 16 Fridays, we went through history with a timeline, playing games those people did, learning where they were in the world.
Can you imagine if you volunteered to teach, primitive skills or knot tying or knife sharpening? Probably wouldn't be good for 4-year-olds, but 6-year-olds. But I mean, first aid or, stuff like that, or something that was interesting. You could just we're going to teach survival. And look, you're going to learn how to start fires and
tie knots
and tie knots. And, you could easily integrate all that stuff. And then a lot of people also integrate things like the Boy Scouts. They'll make that part of their homeschooling. So their kids are Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. Whatever.
And the other thing was, my oldest son, I taught through Algebra 1, and I didn't do well at geometry. Let's just say it's a good thing New York has multiple choice final exams, because otherwise I would not have passed. So I'm like, I can't teach you geometry. So I took him to the co-op, and he learned geometry from a woman with a master's in math, and he loved it. And then he took Algebra 2 from her. And he was signed up to take trigonometry from her, and she decided to move to Russia. And you're like, okay, well, I can't teach trig because I did never have it.
Yeah.
So I took him to the local community college, and he had to take an entrance exam. He tested into calculus. And I said, you know what? I have 2 online friends who are professors in calculus, and they're always saying, how do kids get into my calculus class not able to do math? And I'm like, well, they are like you. They can test into calculus. So, yeah, you still have to go take trig and pre-cal before you can take calculus. But starting at 14, he took math and science and then English and history at the local community college. And by the time he was 18, his birthday's in August, he had 74 hours of dual credit classes. Wow. And in Texas, dual credit students pay half price at public schools.
Really?
Because we guarantee an education through high school.
Uh-huh.
And he wasn't 18 yet. So as long as I say, yeah, he's still in a 10th grader, 11th grader, 12th grader, he gets half price.
Oh, that's neat.
Yeah, and so, I mean, dual credit classes are something that, they didn't have that much. They didn't have that at all, if I remember right, when I was a teenager. But now...
AP.
Yeah, we had, AP. But now there's a lot more of that, and a lot more of, like, community colleges coming into high schools and teaching dual credit classes. So you can take calculus, and it'll count both as a college credit and as a high school credit. And so... it's not as unusual now to put your kid in, send him to a community college. I mean, they have special rules. Like, until you're 16, a parent has to be on campus. They don't have to be in the class, but they have to be on campus.
You can go take pottery or something while your kid's taking calculus.
Or go to the library for an hour or whatever. And I mean, in her case, she taught. So she was teaching at the community college. So she just scheduled the classes at the same time. After that, he could go on his own. So the dual credit thing isn't really, I mean, yes, our kid is extremely brilliant and all that, but it's not as unusual nowadays as it used to be to send your kid to school earlier. And, he took one class at 14 at the community college. And we were like, well, we don't know if this is going to work, but we'll send you and we'll, do that. And if it hadn't worked, we'd have found some other way to deal with it. Mm-hmm. That's just the way it is. I mean, you just adapt to whatever your problems are.
So what about... Well, let's get to the big scary one that I think a lot of people worry about. And before it was a reasonable consideration for me, not that I have kids yet, but I like to think ahead. So, but there is the social stigma of, oh, you were homeschooled, or, oh, your children were, oh, you're one of those. But I mean, we have the same stigma as preppers.
Yeah.
So, but how did y'all deal with how did that enter your lives? I mean, what was that like when you told friends that weren't interested in homeschooling? How did that kind of play out?
The worst was my parents.
Yeah.
Because they were so pro-education. When I was born, the first words my dad said were, go to college and finish before you get married.
Yeah.
Those were the first words of advice to his brand new baby daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So they were terrified that their baby daughter, who was brilliant, would ruin their grandbaby's lives.
Even though you had a doctorate in education.
Well, not in education.
Not
English. But they were like, oh, you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know what a kindergartner and a first grader and I said, Mama, really? Do you think I'm not smart enough to teach my kid to read? You love to read. You taught me to love to read. I love to read. I'm going to teach my kids to love to read. That's half the battle.
Mm-hmm.
And it was probably 4 years of, oh, you're going to ruin my babies, before they went, okay, this is working out well.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the worst. The other thing was I was totally paranoid that I would get arrested.
Really?
Because some parts, even though it's legal in Texas and the United States, some school districts are very against it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're out with your children,
truancy.
You'll have truancy issues. And I can do school for my first grader in 30 minutes. What am I going to do the other 7.5 hours that everyone else is in school? Well, we're going to go to the grocery store and we're going to do math. If we only have $10, what else can we buy?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't do that. We went grocery shopping in the afternoon after school got out. Mm-hmm. Or in the early morning before school got in. Because I was afraid I'd get arrested.
Was this something that someone else you knew had gotten arrested for or gotten harassed about, or?
I don't think we knew any of our friends. Yeah, I don't think any of our friends had their issues, but we joined the legal association because Homeschool Legal Defense, HSLDA, because there are areas where you are persecuted, like Houston Independent School District.
Really?
Is not very fond of homeschoolers. Humble Independent School District, where we lived, was. So they didn't have hassles. Mm-hmm. Houston Independent School District, hassles.
That's interesting. I wonder why, because I wouldn't imagine that they would lose out.
First of all, they lose, it's $2,000 a year for every student they lose.
That's not in a seat.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
So that's part of it. The other is, teacher unions protect their jobs. And obviously, if a parent can do something, you can't be doing it right. You need a professional. So there's all kinds of reasons. You also run into another issue that people are afraid of, and this is actually more real, is someone doesn't like you for whatever reason. And so they report you to social services. Right. And then social services shows up at your door and says, we want to talk to your kids and search your house and blah, blah, blah. Because you're homeschooling, obviously you're doing something bad for your kids. And it may be that it's a parent or a grandparent or a non-custodial parent. So those are issues that you can have, and homeschooling can make you look less normal, and therefore you can have issues with that, which is one of the reasons you get, it's just PLA, LD, whatever it is. We'll put a note in the show notes, because they will protect you and protect your rights.
So if a truancy officer or a police officer or the social worker come to your door and you have membership in a legal defense, whichever one it is, states have them, and there's a national one for the U.S., you get their card out, you call them and you say, I have a police officer at my door. And they say, hand them the phone. And you hand the phone out the door, and your lawyer talks to the police officer.
Nice.
Because your $150 a year pays for an on-call lawyer if you are
having an issue,
citation or have an issue based on homeschooling. And that includes issues with custodial, non-custodial parents in a divorce. If they say, oh, they're homeschooling, I should get the kids, they'll show up for that as well.
Nice. That's a nice insurance policy.
Yeah, and it is. It's basically homeschooling insurance. It's not that expensive, and it's part of it's like the national community too. I mean, really, everybody joins that.
Or
should. And so you have, and they have a lot of resources and related things, and they'll have conferences and stuff that you can go to. So,
like the NRA or a lot of these different organizations that protect different rights.
You get more power the more of you that are in it.
Oh, yeah.
And really, we talk about being afraid, but it's nothing now compared to what it was
in the 80s,
30 years ago.
Yeah, it's, even in general conversations with people, it seems to have become much more mainstream.
Yeah,
and we can even say, again, because at one point, as we were talking before the show, in history, the idea of institutionalized education is a fairly new idea.
Until the 20th century, most students were taught at home. Most. Even into 1915, 1920, most kids still were taught at home. They didn't go to public schools. It's only been the 20th century and now the 21st that the majority of U.S. students are in public schools, that the state is educating them instead of the family.
Yeah. And it's we could go into the history of it, but part of that's the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
We had to do something with the kids once we decided we weren't going to put them in the factories anymore. We want to put mom and dad in the factory, and so what do we do with them? Well, hey, the state will provide this, and that'll allow us to do that. There's lots of different things. And actually, we were looking up what's happened in the state of Texas, and, homeschooling was perfectly legal. And in Texas, they consider homeschools a private school. So you have the same requirements as a private school, which are teaching 5 particular things. And I can tell you those in a minute. But what happened was in the 80s, the Texas Education Agency said, no, that's wrong. They're not private schools. You can't homeschool. And
arrested a whole bunch of
people. And this court case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court came back in Texas and said, no, they unanimously said homeschooling is private schooling and it is perfectly legal. And one of the points they made was Texas education has been around since 1912. And in 1912, 10% of the population was publicly educated. Everybody else was that. And at that time, nobody said, oh, no, it's not right. And all for this past 60, 70 years, it's been policy that it hasn't been right. So why are you suddenly deciding, oh, now it's not right? That was basically their thing, is this is not, it seems uncommon now, but it was not uncommon for much of our history.
So the historical precedence was there, and they were like, no, that was the historical precedence when we made the law. That's what everyone understood it to mean. That's what it means until we change it. Yeah. We are not changing it.
Yeah, if you want to change the law, but you can't suddenly decide that the way we've been doing it has been wrong and then, illegal, and now it's not.
You just brought up Industrial Revolution, which raises and both parents being off to the factory instead of the parents and the kids being off to the factory. How does that work? How do you have, I mean, I think for a lot of families, it's almost impractical to not have two working parents, unless you have a parent that is one or two parents that are particularly successful that can afford to support the family or have decided on a lifestyle that is enough to be supported by.
And I mean,
one
we
parent.
have to say that in fact, that Savannah did not work full time when she was educating our children. So we made that choice.
And he wasn't particularly successful the first 10 years.
Well, yeah, it got finances. To be easier financially later in my career.
At first it was, well, if this is important, we need to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't think I could do it and work full time.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, okay, if we have to do this, then I won't work. Part of that was just gender expectations.
Mm-hmm.
You know, moms stay home, dads go to work.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's old fashioned. Relatively speaking, I would say actually in my family, that's not true. My grandmother worked outside the home. My great-grandmother worked outside the home. My great-great-grandmother worked outside the home. My mother was the first stay-at-home mom in 4 generations.
Oh, wow.
On both sides of her family.
Mm-hmm.
But the expectation of society is if one stays home, it's the mom.
The traditional role is, yeah.
And I that's not always.
Plus, you were more qualified to teach than I was.
That's true. But it's not always true that it's the mom who stays home or who does the education. And there are people who do work and homeschool.
Mm-hmm.
And they work outside the home and homeschool. That amazes me.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the ones I've talked to who have done a good job or what I think is a good job, they go to school, they go to work, and their kid is home and safe for whatever reason. Either somebody else is there or an older sibling, or they just trust them at a younger age than the police would. And 12 is usually when the police would not bother a kid at home by themselves.
Mm.
And they come home after work, and that's when their school day starts.
Okay.
So they're doing their schooling when everybody else is doing their get ready for dinner, goof off, play. No, this is our school time. You play all day now. This is school.
Mm-hmm.
And that works.
Yeah, and I guess it doesn't matter when you get it in as long as you get it in.
Right. And I think it also varies depending on how old your children are. Like Savannah started working more when our kids were older. I mentioned that she went and taught at the community college when Elijah was going to school. Well, that meant she was working and like one of our kids was home, but that kid was 12, 13, and he wasn't home all day by himself. He was home while she was teaching.
For 3 hours.
Yeah. And some school, some jobs, you could have 2 parental jobs where one parent is home or one parent works from home, even though they have they have a job, they're working. So the children are not completely on their own. I think you would have a very difficult time, 2 parents with a 40 or 60-hour a week job
out of the house
at the same time with small children. I just don't know that you can make that work.
Yeah, that would be tricky.
Which is part of the reason that we have public education when it is and what it is. You could definitely have situations where you had different working schedules. I'm in EMS. You work 2 days a week. You just work 24 hours those days. If those days happen to coincide when your spouse was home, you could work that out. So there is a flexibility you could have if you both if you had jobs that were flexible like that. But having 2 careers that are the traditional 40 hours a week, those 8 hours a day during the day, those 5 days a week, you're going to have a tough time not putting your kids in a public school.
Well, I think also telecommuting has become more and more popular, so that would ease up some schedules. You can kind of load balance and juggle your day, perhaps, with that as part of it a little bit better, especially when you're saying, 15 minutes for a 6-year-old or
and when
5-year-old.
And also because the issue isn't so much do you have time to teach, it's do you have your children unsupervised?
Yeah.
And they're kind of 2 different issues. And so, your kids, you may be working 8-10 hours a day, even if you're at home.
Yeah.
Your kids aren't unsupervised, but that time you're spending, you're working. You're not spending it teaching your kids. So you can balance those 2 things.
There's also the thing that sometimes homeschooling, at least in our situation is not necessarily a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Be a grandparent.
Yeah.
It could be an aunt or uncle. So I have a colleague who homeschooled the neighbor kids.
Mm-hmm.
She homeschooled her kids. The neighbor saw that, said, I want to have homeschooling, but I can't do that because we can't afford that. And she said, I'll take your kids in and I'll homeschool them. As long as I'm your agent, it's a private school. So it's still 1 to 4 instead of 1 to 14 or 1 to 30.
Yeah.
But it's not actually the parent. And I know of at least 2 situations where that's true. One of them is a single mom in a inner city experience, and the homeschooler said, hey, let's help you.
That's pretty cool.
And another issue you talked about choosing lifestyle-wise, a lot of times people are like, I don't want to send my kids to public schools, but both my wife and I work, and so we'll send them to a private school. Then you have to look at that financially. Suanna took a job to send our kid to the school that first year. And you start looking at the money, and especially when you had a second kid. If you have 2 kids, that's almost an average full-time income to send your 2 kids to private school.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, depending on what your incomes are, but it could easily be where you're looking at, like, we can spend all the money it takes to have a job and send our kids to a private school, or we can just have you stay home.
Yeah.
And we cut our expenses, and, our kids get this education.
And I think the other big stigma with it is my kid is going to be a sociotard if I do not have them around other children, if I'm just...
I will say that everyone wants to know that.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Yeah.
Even people who want to homeschool.
Yeah.
What do you do about socialization?
Uh-huh.
And I have 3 thoughts on that. 1, who do you want your kid to learn from?
Mm-hmm.
20 little 5-year-olds? Push, pull, pull your hair, scream, yell, cuss, whatever they do at home, or your mom and dad.
Yeah.
Who do you want them to learn how to be social from?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A bunch of little kids or parents and friends and whatever.
And and that's something too. When you say socialization, what do you mean? What do you want that outcome to be? I mean, we're like, oh, you need to be social. You need to learn how to deal with other kids. Well, you know what? That Lord of the Flies middle school that you go through, is that the socialization you want your kids to learn? And I mean, that's actually something that people talk about is if your kid is primarily around adults for most of their childhood, you know what they learn how to be? Adults. Yeah. If they're around kids their age, what they learn to do is deal with that peer group. And that then when they get out and they have to go into the real world, suddenly they have to learn how to be around adults. And that's actually a socialization that homeschool kids get that other kids don't have. I mean, how many people do you know that went all through high school and then they immediately went to college and they learned how to party at college and then they graduated and bam, they're in a job. And now they have to learn how to deal with people that are twice their age.
Oh, yeah.
In a way that they're not my teacher. They're someone who have an and you know what? If they had spent a few years being around nothing but adults, when that happened, they'd have a different frame of reference that you don't necessarily get.
I noticed that personally, which was most of my friends growing up had what you're talking about, and it was this very jarring realization of, I guess, what we commonly refer to as the real world. I have a frog in my throat today that won't seem to get out. But whereas I grew up, you got out of school and you went to the family business. And so I spent the majority of my time around adults and around a business, which wasn't the most exciting childhood in the world, but there were things that realizations that most people have once they get out into the working world of how things work and the way the academic theory versus the real life theory of how things go on and what those nuances are. That was stuff I already knew, while my friends were going, oh, wow, I didn't know this. And it was this very jarring, oh, I can't go party till 4 o'clock in the morning. I've got to get up and go to work, and they stumble through that. But
I mean, that's a lot of kids, they go to school, they're around their peers all day. The only interaction with adults they have are their teachers who are over around 30 kids and you have a very specific kind of relationship with that teacher.
Yeah.
And then they get out. Their parents are not home yet. So they go home and they're either by themselves, they're either being taught by the television, or they're out with their friends. And that's their socialization. Whereas a homeschooling kid wakes up in the morning, interacts with their parents all day, may have to go do things with, other adults. That's their interactions. And then they get to play with kids.
Mm-hmm.
And we could talk, and I'll let Savannah go now about socialization with other kids too.
Well, the other thing is everybody assumes homeschoolers are going to be isolated.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they're going to be only with you. I don't know about you, but 24 hours a day, I love my kids. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365. I'm going, what can they do?
Yeah.
All right. So my kids played soccer. They went to Y day camp in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
They went to church. They went to church camp. And lots of people do homeschooling group sports. They do drama. They do community theater with the kids. There's kid theater, children's theater. There's scouts.
The normal extracurricular activities children would be engaged in.
And then you do that as a homeschooler.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's after school. They have a lot more choices, opportunities. We go to the library.
Mm-hmm.
Just know the librarians. You go to the museum. You go to the museum a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The museum guards start talking to you. Hey, did you see we got a new picture in here? Come here, let me tell you about it.
Yeah.
You go to a museum, the docent's talking. You go to church, the docent's talking. Whatever you're doing. And homeschoolers get socialized that way. And it's not just adults. It's not just their parents. It's other kids and other adults.
It's kind of like the prepper idea that you're out living in a compound, by yourself and you never interact with other people. Well, you could choose to live that way, and I'm sure there are homeschoolers that do that exact thing. They're living out in the compound.
Yeah.
And yes, when that happens, they can end up a little freaky, but they're going to end up a little freaky for a number of reasons. It have to do with the fact they didn't go to school. They didn't go to a public school or a private school. Do you have a third one?
Yeah, basically, students learn to act like whoever they interact with.
Yeah.
So, I take my kids to the Philharmonic,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone's dressed up, everyone's quiet, everyone's listening, but they're not all day having to sit quiet.
Yeah.
And we go to the museum and we do the kids section. So they get to be on TV, in the science forum, and they get to draw in the sand, and they get to, dig, and they get to break fossils open. And hey, they're interacting with the teachers there.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not all just learning from me. And yet it's not 30 kids all day long or 150 kids with 8 different classes. You know?
What are some of the other things? I mean, the socialization is kind of the biggest one that people worry about. But what are we missing here? I mean, what other pitfalls do you experience or stigmas do you experience?
People worry about when they're deciding to be homeschooled. And I think one of the things we should probably talk about is we're assuming you have a choice. And as preppers, we have to prepare for the situation where you may not have a choice. But the things they worry about are socialization. The big thing that Savannah would always go, I could never do that, because they either think they don't have enough education to educate their kids, or they just couldn't stand to be around their kids that much, which is completely reasonable.
Either,
Yeah.
Yes. I'm with my kids 4 hours a day. All right. That tries your patience. I'm with my kids 24 hours a day. Okay, that's a little bit more trying sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But
so
you also get more patience. The more you need, the more you have to.
Yeah, I would imagine you develop the skill of patience if you don't already have it.
Or you develop the skill of making your kids not be crazy. It may be that you're spending 4 hours a day with your kids and you feel guilty that that's all the time you have to spend with them. So you let them do anything they want and they get crazy and then they drive you crazy. And then you're like, I want to do less. Well, if your kids are driving you crazy in 4 hours and then they drive you crazy for 8 hours, about hour 9, you're like, okay, you're going to stop driving me crazy.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to figure out what we need to do to get you to act like a normal human being and not like a hellion.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel guilty anymore. Now I'm just going to, And I think that is real, that people do, in fact, interact with their kids different when they only interact with them for 4 hours a day than they interact with them when they're having to interact with them.
Yeah, I would imagine you're forced at that point to deal with the issue at hand.
Maybe the fact that, you go to work all day and you come home when you're tired and you only have a few hours with your kids and you feel guilty that that's all you have. And so you're more permissive, or you just don't have the energy to handle it, or whatever. Those issues get taken away when you flip things upside down, and now you're spending all day with them. And if they get to be they want to run around and be crazy, and because they've been sitting in whatever for 4 hours. Your kids sit for 8 hours a day, and they come home and suddenly they have a whole bunch of energy they need to burn off.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're an hour into school in the morning and your kids aren't sitting still and they're bouncing off the walls and they're not paying attention, you can go, okay, that's it. Go outside and run around this house 10 times. I mean, I think we literally that was one of the things we would make our kids do is you can't sit still. I want you to go literally run around the house 5 times and come back in.
Mm-hmm.
And they would go outside and run around our little house 5 times, and they would come back in, and then they would be like, and they would sit still because they burned off some of that physical energy.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are just all those issues are different. There's a different, when you change the context as dramatically as you change it from being with your kids all day long and not being with your kids all day long, you've changed that context so much that you really have no idea how big a difference that's going to make in the way your kids act, the way you act, the way everything works.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really true, because we would go out and we'd go on nature hikes. Mm-hmm. That's not at the store; nobody will see you. Okay, so we'd go out on nature hikes, and we would do science. Let's count the trees.
Mm-hmm.
Which one of these can I eat?
Yeah. Which one of these can you eat? Which one of these can you not touch without possibly having an allergic reaction? And just talk about whatever. What you know is what your kids will know. What you talk about is what your kids will talk about. I was so worried because I know I'm not great at math that my kids knew math. And then I went, oh, wait, we haven't done much with writing. Oops. Because writing was what my PhD was in.
Yeah.
Okay. But they got really good at that because they knew mom cared and mom was good at it. And I had the skills to teach that. But they also had a great background in math because I knew I didn't have the skills in that. So we did puzzles and we did games and we did pattern recognition and we did counting and we did music. Anything that I heard, oh, this will help with math, we did.
So in a sense, her weakness, she overcompensated for, and that, that took care of it. But because I know we've been going for a long time, and maybe we've completely intimidated you, and you're like, oh my gosh, maybe those Davis people can do that, but I can never do. Oh, she's talking about all this crazy stuff, and birthday parties, and I don't know. I'm not going to do that. Whatever reason you've decided not to do it, there may be a situation, and we have to look at it from a prepper or survivalist point of view, where you don't have the choice.
Yeah.
What happens if the economy gets really bad and taxes aren't there and we don't pay our teachers and one day they all go on strike? Like, oh, that could never happen. Well, it happened in Brazil. All the public school teachers went on strike for a year and a half. So during that year and a half, what happens with your kids? Well, now you don't have any choice. Guess what? You're homeschooling. If that were, if from a prepper point of view, you say, okay, I have to prepare for the possibility that I won't have a choice and I will have to educate my kids. What do I need as some basics that I could get as a prepper ahead of time? And I know the first thing I would say, and Suanna would probably say too, is this book on teaching your kids to read. What's the book?
Yeah, there's a book called Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. And it tells you exactly what to say, where to point, how to point, what to get your kid to say. It's very short daily assignment for 100 days. Most of my friends used it, taught their kids to read at age 4.
Wow.
Now, obviously, that didn't work for my kids.
Yeah.
My oldest learned and said, I'm not reading. I'm the only one who cares. But then he went to private school and learned in a week. I'm pretty sure it wasn't because his teacher was teaching him. I'm pretty sure it was because he already knew. And then my youngest, we tried it and it wasn't working so well. And I'm like, okay, I've read some studies and there's some argument that teaching a child to read before he's able gives the learning disabilities, which is why we have so many learning disabilities now. It's not just a matter of noticing. It's a matter of we're causing them. And at least 2 major educators have argued that as long as the opportunity is there, every child will learn to read who's not mentally handicapped will learn to read by the age of 9. Well, you know what? When you're sitting around and all your friends' kids are reading at 4, and your kid is 8 and you're still reading their assignments, it is really hard to remember that.
Yeah, I would imagine.
But I also have a sister who's learning disabled. She's got dyslexia really badly. And I didn't want to repeat that with my kids. So I would just like bite my tongue and twist my fingers and go, he's not 9, he's not 9, he's not 9, he's not, it's like the magic words.
Yeah.
And when he was 8.5, I said, Mom, I really want to read Harry Potter. I said, that'd be cool. He goes, I don't know how to read. I said, no, you don't. I don't think I could read Harry Potter by myself. No, probably not yet. How can I get ready? Well, you have to read a little bit. Remember that book? Yeah. You want to go back? Oh, yeah. We went back to that book. We did the basic things at 8.5. He started reading individual pages. Then he was reading chapters in children's books, not in grown-up books. And when he would read a page, I would read Harry Potter to him for a chapter. And I don't really think it was just because he wanted to hear Harry Potter. I think it was because he was ready.
Time.
He was ready. And he's an amazing reader. But he didn't learn until he was 8.5.
To kind of go back to socialization for just a second, and I forgot to ask this a little bit earlier, which was what kind of, since you now have one of your oldest son is in college.
Both of them are in college.
Both of them are in college. How did that transition from being around mostly adults all the time to then being around within their peer group? How did that work out?
Our two boys are very different. That's a thing I think you would pick up on listening to us talk about it. That our kids are very different in the way they interact with different things. They're different with each other, not different from other children in general. Well,
I mean, all of our everybody's
Yeah.
kids are different. Yeah,
but I mean, that's a point too. You think, well, I know some kids are different from other kids, and in families these are different, but you don't realize that our two kids are dramatically different. One of them is very mathematical and very analytical and very introverted. And that's our eldest. He's almost done with a degree in actuarial science at the University of Texas.
He's 20.
And he's 20. And he's the one who went at 14, started at the community college and did all this stuff. And then went to UT, lives in a dorm, doesn't have a whole lot of social interaction. He's very introverted, and he goes to class, he comes home, and that's the way he wants to live. And I think it's completely bizarre, but it seems to be working for him. Our other son became very active in his church's youth group in middle school and has been very social in that group and has now gone off to college. He's a freshman this year and has become hugely socially active at school.
So it had nothing to do
with
other than individual.
No difference one way or the other in their socialization. Our eldest knows how to talk to adults. He's a bit of an introvert and maybe doesn't want to talk to adults, but he knows how to deal with adults.
Yeah.
And
probably
really
better than he knows
kids.
how to deal with other kids his age.
Yeah, but he's really good with younger kids.
Yeah. I think the socialization thing really has less to do with how they go to school.
More about the
and
individual.
More to do with the individual.
Yeah, it's just like anything.
Yeah.
I mean any
some
kind
kids
of
some people are introverts and some people are extroverts. Yeah. And to some extent, I think you can learn skills that compensate for that. I know in my life that I would say I didn't learn how to talk to people, especially members of the opposite sex, until I was, in my 40s, and discovered. I remember reading that book, and thinking, "You mean you can learn this stuff?" Really. I was like, "There's like something I can study and figure out how to do this, and that tells me what to say, and there's a structure to how you talk to people and that kind of thing." And so I think you can compensate for that and learn that. But I don't think it's a matter of, it had nothing to do with the way I was educated. I went to public schools. It
was just a personality difference.
It's just a personality thing.
So as far as college admissions go, what happens there?
Nowadays, it's way easier than it used to be in the past. And for us, it wasn't terribly bad. There have been the pioneers of homeschooling who have taught the University of Texas what they have to do when a homeschooler comes to them.
And there are tiers for schools. The homeschool groups have identified schools as tier 1. That means homeschoolers only have to do what everyone else has to do. So we want an ACT score. You get an ACT score from the homeschoolers. We want an SAT score. Homeschoolers give an SAT score. Those are tier 1. My son's only applied to Tier 1 schools. Some people want to go to Tier 2 schools. Well, that means they have to jump through hoops. Some of the schools require a list of every book you have ever studied in your 12 years of homeschooling.
Oh, wow.
Imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
I used 2 science textbooks every year for 10 years. So they have 20 science textbooks, not including science stuff we did just because I remembered it from when I was in biology and I thought it was fun and let's do this.
Yeah.
Not including, oh, Grandpa loves this. Let's go do that with Grandpa. And then every book you've read. Okay, I was in public school and we had to keep a list of the books we read. And after Christmas break, I came back with a list of 112 books. And my teacher said, "You're lying." And I said, "No, I'm not."
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "What did you watch on TV?" And I said, "I don't own a television. I didn't watch television." And she went, "Oh, okay. Well, if you don't have TV, you could read 112 books." My kids read all the time. We had a TV. And they played video games all the time. But they read. Can you imagine trying to keep a list of every book they read for 12 years?
And one thing I should point out is we had to provide a transcript to the University of Texas. Well, she wrote down what they studied and gave them grades for it, which I think they got A's because she pointed, in most cases, because as she points out, she doesn't allow them to have anything left.
Yeah.
Right. You don't get to like, oh, I got through and now it's time to move on. It's like, look, you understand 70% of this. That's not good enough. Let's go back and do it again until you understand 100% of it. So anyway, they do ask for a transcript and you create one and you give it to them. Mm-hmm. Some schools ask for a portfolio, which is like it's examples of what you did, your philosophy of how it went, stuff you created, stuff you studied.
And a reflection
on that stuff. And so you can provide that. But like I said, the homeschools pioneers have taught the schools what they need to know. And I think part of that, too, is homeschool students have gone into public schools at all different levels of schooling and excelled. Mm-hmm. And now schools understand that. When your kid comes in and you say he's been homeschooled, this is probably a kid who's going to excel.
It doesn't mean he's going to walk in with no shoes and dirty feet.
Yeah, and not understand anything because he wasn't really educated. But homeschoolers win the national spelling bees, and they win national science contests, and they win national this, national that. Here's a secret that I've learned recently. The reason certain schools have such exceptional students that graduate from them, like Harvard and Yale and all these top-tier schools, is because they only let exceptional students in the first place. It's the selection process in the beginning, not necessarily what happens in the middle, that makes them who they are in the end. And schools know that. I mean, those people, they know that now. They realize that, and they've learned that you can look at a homeschool student, and first of all, they're probably going to be better educated to start with, but they also have done the stuff that's going to make them excel. They've done science projects and written software and done whatever, exceptional things that you would see in an exceptional public school student, but they've done that as part of what they do. Mm-hmm. And so the stigma going into colleges is a lot less now. Some schools are more open to it than others. Some schools have different requirements. But in general, schools, your general colleges are looking at your SAT scores. They're looking at your transcripts. That's what they look at for everybody. They may have an entrance, whatever, that they do. They look at all those things. They look at the same things with them.
So where does somebody begin? If after listening to us go on for the last hour, if somebody is now saying, this is what I want to do, where do they start? Where do they go? Where do they get resources?
I'd start with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association because they have a list of what you have to teach in every state.
Oh, wow.
Like Texas is a very pro homeschooling state.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Homeschool friendly state.
Yeah, it's very homeschool friendly.
But that might change between different
states. Oh, no, absolutely.
State,
that's why Homeschool
Texas.
Legal Defense Association has a website with every single state's requirements, what you have to do, how you get started, what's legal, if your kid is in public school, how you pull them out without getting arrested, how you do that legally, how you get around problems, what do you need to file, when do you need to file it, what does it need to say. Now, that's not in Texas, but in North Carolina, for instance, you have to file, you have to send paperwork to the school district. You have to test at the end of the year. You have to show 180 days within the school's time frame as well. You have to turn in assignments.
HSDLA will tell you the legal requirements.
And they will. Yeah. They'll tell you the legal requirements. So that's where you start. Find out what your legal requirements are.
Okay. And from there, I'm assuming they probably also have links to communities.
Yeah.
And all the resources.
You can look up online, you know, homeschooling in your particular community. That's what I did. That's how I found homeschooling in Kingwood, Texas. Okay. I looked up homeschooling in Kingwood, Texas, and I found Super Friday. And I'm like, what the heck is that? And I looked on and I called them and they're like, oh, yeah, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, oh, 3 hours with no kids. Yes. Which ones do I have to sign? Yeah. And you know what? I ended up teaching there. So I didn't really end up with 3 hours with no kids. But it was fun stuff. And the kids enjoyed it. And I enjoyed it. And I got to meet other moms and talk about, what do you do when your kid does this? I went to conventions when I was brand new to hear what people said and see what books were available. And it, especially with Chi idea, the community, you got to plan, but you don't have to do it all yourself. If you're not good at something, find somebody you know who's good at that. Yeah. And say, hey, can you teach my kid? Elijah's chemistry teacher was a chemist for Exxon.
Wow. That's a pretty good chemistry teacher.
In a sense, it's a lot like prepping, where you're like, I don't know how to do stuff.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? Somebody does. And if you form a community, that person can teach you something, and maybe you can teach them something. I grow a garden, but I don't know the first thing about starting fires or whatever, you know, and it's the same kind of thing. It's just with what we would call our general education.
And you need to think about what you want them to know.
Yeah.
What's important for you, for your kids. My kids, I wanted them to know a lot about American history. I wanted them to have a strong sense of history in the world. I wanted them to be able to read well and write well. I wanted them to be able to think and problem solve. So I'm going online. You know, what can I do for creative, problem solving? Oh, well, here's a game that makes them think.
Well, we could go on for hours and hours, but that's really great stuff. I mean, I think that even, at least for me, it gives you. Oh, you got one more thing.
Well, I just wanted I wrote notes all over the place, but 5 reasons why you should homeschool. Self-reliance. You need to be able to do it.
Yeah.
Because do you really want the state or somebody else teaching your kids? What's the most important thing in your life? 2, no one will care more than you. No one will care about your kid. No teacher, no principal, nobody. 3, no one will be as motivated as you are to figure out what will work for your kids and be able to do it. 4, it helps kids who are way ahead or could be way ahead, so they're not bored. They don't get in trouble for discipline issues. And it helps kids who might be behind. They don't get labeled. You can go at their pace. They can catch up. So those are the 5 reasons. You can do it. You care. You can help your kids.
That's awesome reasons. I'm sold on it now. I'm ready to have some kids so I can go homeschool them. But with that, we're going to wrap up episode 59. Thank you so much, the Davises, for joining us today and educating us on homeschooling. Do you like talking about survival with like-minded individuals? Of course you do. So get online now and check out the In the Rabbit Hole forum at forum.intherabbithole.com. From the Lone Star State, till next time, stay safe and sound.